Hello, my name is George Falconer, and this is Peniel. I recommend that you get this book, When Heaven is Silent by Ronald Dunn. A great deal of this book is about Peniel and Jacob's encounter with God and how he walked away with a limp and a blessing. This is about suffering. And if you want to read about suffering, if you want to search for any answers, or at least present your questions to God, even if God doesn't directly give you answers, this is a good book. I would recommend it. I'm going to read the 4th chapter of the book of Esther. The situation is this. Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king and his officials, and so she has been deposed. A new queen has been appointed, and this is Esther. They don't know that Esther is a Jew, and that Mordecai has brought her up, and she has been selected, and this edict has gone out to kill all the Jews. Esther doesn't know that, of course, and this is because Mordecai refused to bow down before Haman, who has been elevated, and Haman is a jealous man. And he thinks, who is this man not to bow down before me, like the king has said? But I don't just want to kill him, I'll exterminate all his people because of what one man has done. And that is the situation. Chapter 4. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, that means the edict, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay on sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. Mordecai she sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for the annihilation which had been published in Susa to show Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to urge her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and people of the royal province know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish, and who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Interesting to see that now he's carrying out Esther's instructions. Up until now, she has always carried out his. Well, Esther hasn't been told the full story. She is told that Mordecai is in deep mourning, he's torn his clothes, he's wearing sackcloth, something has upset him. So she thinks that she'll remedy the situation by sending him clothes. That's logical. My cousin, who's effectively my stepfather, is in terrible mourning, he's wearing sackcloth. And he needs clothes, so I'll send some. He refused to wear them because the tearing of his clothes and wearing sackcloth was for mourning. It was for mourning over what had been decreed. And bear in mind too that he and his people have been accused by Haman of not obeying the king's laws. Well, evidently it was a law that nobody could go beyond the gate, before the king's gate, wearing sackcloth. So he obeyed that law. He was wearing sackcloth and he only went as far as the gate. He went as far as the law permitted him. He wasn't one for breaking the law all the time. As I say, I think that this was idolatry about bowing down before Haman, and that's what he wouldn't do. He would obey God's law, not the king's law. So, having refused to accept the clothes that were sent to him, Hathach, the servant who Esther had sent to find out what was going on, Mordecai gave a copy of the king's ruling to the servant. He didn't just tell him about what was going on, he gave him a copy of the script to send back to Esther for her to read. And he also gave this instruction to Esther. He said, "You, Esther, must go to the king and plead the cause for your people, so that your people must be saved. And I'm not taking your clothes. I'm not going to let this go." Esther replies by telling him that anyone who appears before the king without being sent for, there is only one law, and that is, if the king hasn't sent for you and you suddenly appear before him, you should be put to death. With one exception. If the king holds out the royal scepter, your life will be spared. Now, you'll notice that a lot of this book is about appearing before the king. Vashti had refused to appear before the king and was banished. Esther was appointed and appeared before the king in her crown, and here she's being told to go to the king and plead with him the cause, let him know what's happening, and ask him to do something about it so that the Jews will be spared. And Esther has to point out to Mordecai, the law says, I'll die if I do that, except for one thing, a small hope, holding out the scepter. Upon hearing this, Mordecai tells her this. He sends word to her and says, "Don't think that if you do not speak up, then you alone will survive. He says here, do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this? He's saying to her, perhaps you have come to a royal position because God has put you there for this time. It's referring to providence. He's really saying, in providence, perhaps God has put you into this position to do what I'm telling you to do now. So Esther then sends word back. Gather together all the Jews in the locality, pray and fast for 3 days, and then I will go to the king. She knows that she's risking her life, and she says to him, if I perish, I perish. She has no assurance the royal sceptre will be held out to her. God hasn't told her in advance what he's going to do. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. God doesn't necessarily tell us things in advance. Instead, providence unfolds as we go about carrying out God's will and being faithful to him. And who knows, you might find yourself in a position whereby you are where you are because God has brought you to where you are for such a time as this, whatever it might be. Perhaps there's things that you've got to say to people that God wants you to say. Perhaps there are things that you need to do for God wants you to do. And he's brought you into a position whereby you're able to say these things or do these things, and then God will take what you do to his glory for his purposes. All Esther knows is she's got to do this. She's got to risk her own life in order that the Jews might be saved. That's what she knows. And she's also doing it in obedience to what Mordecai has said, and I also think she's doing it in obedience to God. Her heart must have been thumping when she did it, because there's nothing casual about it. She knows that she's going to do it in 3 days. Now notice she prepares for this. She doesn't suddenly just take off and decide, I'm going to go and see the king. 3 days of prayer and fasting were poured into this. And she also says this, and this is an interesting thought. I and my maids will pray. She didn't just say, just I will pray. I and my maids. It makes me wonder what sort of influence she was on the maids. Had they turned to God because of things that she had told them? She was having a prayer meeting in the palace to the real God, not to the gods of the king or Haman or anyone else. The maids as well. So we'll find out what happens in the next chapter.